Hi, I'm Rowan from Vantage Admissions. With interview season on the horizon, many applicants to Oxford and Cambridge will be starting to think about how to best prepare for their interviews. Now, anyone who's done any research at all into advice for Oxbridge interviews will have come across the suggestion that you need to think out loud. But such advice is often quite vague as to what exactly that means. In this video, we're going to explore the various ways that you can showcase your thought process and demonstrate your problem-solving skills to the interviewer. Although we're going to predominantly look at mathematics examples, the advice given will apply for any interview with a heavy technical focus. Firstly, it's absolutely vital that you develop the ability and confidence to share your ideas in real time as you form them. Understandably, given the pressure of an interview, students are often very reluctant to share ideas before they've had a chance to mentally filter through them and make sure that the idea is going to lead somewhere. It's very natural to be worried about looking silly or saying something wrong. But remember that part of being an effective problem solver is being able to generate a large number of ideas and then filter through them, identify which ideas will lead somewhere and which perhaps will not. So the interviewer won't hold it against you if you make a suggestion that has some flaw in it, even if it's wrong because you're overlooking something. In fact, showing the ability to identify the problem with the idea you've generated is a way to impress. Likewise, don't be too worried about going down a route that's not going to lead anywhere, even a wrong path. This isn't like an exam where there is a prescriptive mark scheme, say, with marks allocated to specific steps and then to the final answer. It's an interview where the interviewer is going to be forming an ultimately slightly subjective sense of your abilities as a problem solver. Sometimes an idea that is doomed from the start, that's never going to lead anywhere on this particular problem, might nonetheless be a really interesting, creative idea that actually will impress them and therefore count in your favour. So it's not always about getting things right. It's important to cultivate the skill of thinking in real time, out loud, as you actually work through the problem. And at first, this might feel clunky and difficult. You might find it actually inhibits your problem solving. So it's important to get regular practice. You can do this with a friend, with a family member, even on your own, in an empty room, just talking to yourself. The more you do it, the more it will become automatic. And what students typically find is that when you do develop a sort of mental muscle memory of how to speak as you think, it will actually help you to formulate your thoughts more precisely and therefore to solve problems. Now, in relation to the fact we want to show the interviewer that we are actually sharing our ideas straight away, it's really important as much as possible to lead with motivations. Ideas generally don't pop into our head fully formed. We'll start by thinking about a motivation for the idea. So, for example, consider the following problem where we want to prove an inequality which is obeyed by all integrals. Now, you might have some ideas. You might, for example, think about expanding the brackets. But rather than leading with the suggestion of what you're going to do, lead with the motivation for it. For example, we know that integrals are linear. We can split an integral of a sum up into a sum of integrals, and we can pull constants out. So that means that expanding the brackets is going to make things tidier. We can split things into simpler pieces rather than messier. Likewise, you can flag up some of your first thoughts, which might be identifying difficulties rather than ideas. For example, spotting that direct integration is going to lead nowhere because we don't know what the functions f and g are, or thinking about the fact that in this expression, there's not necessarily an obvious place where an inequality is going to creep in. So identifying reasons that you might filter out certain lines of attack, like actually performing an integral, is also very valuable, as well as identifying the ideas for what you actually might do. Now, all the way through when you're expanding on your ideas, you do want to make sure that it's clear to the interviewer that you have a willingness to take an exploratory mindset. You don't want to give the sense that if you don't have a fully baked idea that's going to lead right the way through to the solution of the problem in one go, that you're not willing to follow that line of attack. You need to show a willingness to take the initiative, to try things, assess where that thing takes you, and then think about the next steps from there. Doing this doesn't show, sort of recklessness. That's what some students worry about. I'm going to do something without a clear plan. But rather, it shows a comfort, moving outside the framework of rote learning with an oven-ready method that's always going to solve the problem, and towards the more creative approach of experimenting with methods and simply seeing where they take you. Now, given the difficulty of the questions you're likely to encounter, and the relative time pressure of an interview, it's very likely, in fact almost certain, that at some point the interviewer will offer some hints. Now, as well as the practical purpose these serve of helping you solve the problem, avoid spending too long with a false approach, for instance, they also serve as a way to test your teachability. Although they're primarily looking to assess your strength in your chosen subject, your problem-solving skills, they are also assessing your teachability and your suitability to small group teaching. That would be supervisions at Cambridge or tutorials at Oxford. So to show that you are suited to small group teaching, it's really important that you show a responsiveness to hints. If you're pursuing a particular line of attack that you feel is leading somewhere, and the interviewer makes a suggestion to do something else that maybe doesn't align with what you had in mind, it can be very tempting to almost ignore their hint, to keep on with the direction you've chosen. This is a big mistake. Firstly, if the interviewer is giving you a hint, they're doing so for a reason. They know the question. They're doing it because they know, for example, that the line of attack you're currently on is not likely to lead anywhere good. And also, other than the fact that following their hint is going to help you solve the problem, it can inadvertently appear rude if you ignore what they've suggested and just carry on with what you're doing. It can appear, for example, stubborn. So it's important to engage with their hints, but also to be seen to engage with their hints. Don't, for example, take their hint and then just carry on discussing what you were discussing, but keeping what they said in the back of your mind. Actually make a direct response to what they've said. The next thing that you say verbally should be a direct engagement with their hint, so that it's completely obvious that you really are latching on to what they've said. Now, a related but equally important point is don't assume that questions asked by the interviewer are rhetorical. This is something that, for example, in mock interviews, I see all the time. You ask a question to a student, and they essentially take it as a rhetorical question that's instructing them to think about something. This can also inadvertently appear rude, appear as if you're not really engaging with the interview as a conversation. So if you are asked a direct question, the next thing you say should be a direct answer to that question. Don't take the question as rhetorical. Now, it doesn't have to be a definitive answer. If you don't know the answer to their question, you don't have to give a direct conclusion, yes or no, or whatever the case may be. But you want to say something which is directly engaging with the question asked. It's a conversation. Supervisions and tutorials are also conversations. And so you want to show that you are suited to that setting. Now, although the exact format of interview questions does vary wildly, many questions will be comprised of multiple parts, much like admissions test questions. Now, even just from having studied A-level or IB or equivalent, you're likely to be very familiar with the idea that sometimes a result you prove in one part of a question will have to be used later. So if you do have a multi-part question, of course you should be looking for opportunities to use any results proved earlier on. But something that's very easy to forget is it may not be that you want to use a result from earlier, but you might want to use the same method or the same broad line of attack, perhaps adapted. So definitely in multi-part questions, seek quite aggressively opportunities to connect parts, but don't be so rigid as to just think about the use of the result itself. Also ask if there are lessons, techniques developed in the earlier parts that can now be carried forwards. This can also be a really nice opportunity to redeem yourself if you've had to be, for example, a little bit spoon-fed in earlier parts. Maybe the first part of a question just didn't gel with you very well, and ultimately the interviewer had to give you lots of hints and essentially show you how to do it. There's no need to despair in such a situation. That doesn't mean the interview is doomed to go badly, Because if in the subsequent part, you're then able to take the same idea and apply it perhaps to a more complicated case, this is actually a fantastic opportunity to show your teachability. So it's not over until the very end of the interview. So as a quick example, consider this question. Now, I'm not going to go through it in full, although for maths applicants especially, I'd recommend do have a think about this problem. In the first part, we're thinking about the last digits of square numbers. And in the second part, we're thinking about something also relating to the second to last digit. Now, although we are going to make some use of the result proved in part 1, the main connection is actually the method being used. So, slight spoiler, in part 1, you'll find that consideration of remainders is the most straightforward way to attack the problem. Specifically, remainders after division by 10. In part 2, remainders division by 10 will no longer be a powerful enough tool, but by sticking with the idea that we can consider remainders divided by something else, I'm not going to spoil that, you will be able to solve the second part. So it's not always the result, it's often the method or a simple adaptation of the method. Now, it's all very well to say, avoid silences, keep talking, keep sharing your ideas. But on a difficult problem, it's likely that at some point you will genuinely have run out of ideas. There will be some difficulty in the problem, and any lines of attack that come into your mind, you'll be able to see, perhaps for very obvious immediate reasons, that they will not succeed. So it can be really difficult to avoid the dreaded silence in such a situation, where it's not just that we haven't got a confident line of attack, we've actually got nothing at all that comes to mind. Now, in such a situation, the best thing to do is try to articulate as precisely as possible exactly what it is that's making the problem difficult. Articulate the exact obstruction that's blocking progress. This achieves two things. Firstly, there is a world of difference between a student who is so stuck that they can't even take the measure of the problem and identify what's making it challenging. So stuck you don't even know why you're stuck. Versus another student who might, have equally few ideas for making progress, but has at least managed to take the measure of the problem and to identify where the difficulty comes from. It shows that you do have more insight into the question you're dealing with. And moreover, by forcing yourself to put into words exactly what the obstruction is, it may be, and very often will be the case, that you'll actually be able to see what you need to do to start to work around that obstruction. Now, secondly, the ability to articulate the obstruction is a really nice way to demonstrate teachability. There's almost nothing worse when working with a student in a small group teaching setting than a student who says, I'm stuck, I don't get it, I'm confused, but can't even explain what the issue is, can't explain why they're stuck, can't explain specifically what it is they don't understand. It makes it very difficult to get the most out of small group teaching, where the whole benefit is that you can hone in on the confusion of an individual student. So by showing that you are able to identify precisely what it is that's confusing you, what it is you're stuck with, you're demonstrating that you are well suited to small group teaching and that you will be a pleasure rather than a nuisance to teach. So consider, for example, the following really quite challenging interview question. Now, again, I'm not going to work through this today, although I would strongly recommend maths applicants do have a go. But I just want to use this as an example of a really tough question where there's quite a lot you can say about why the problem is hard. For example, we're talking about the square root of 2, which is an irrational number. It's a classic example of an irrational number. And yet, given that a and b are positive integers, the two bounds that we're supposed to consider are manifestly rational. They're of the form integer over integer. So there's a funny mismatch there, and it seems difficult to see how I'm going to make the connection to root 2, which is something irrational. Now, a second obstruction, a second difficulty, is we're not told in the question which of these two values is going to be the upper bound and which is going to be the lower bound. Moreover, it seems pretty obvious that for different combinations of a and b, either could be bigger than the other one. So, for example, if I let a be really big and b be, for example, 1, a over b is going to be very, very large, whereas the second expression won't necessarily be as large, because it has the large parameter a on both the numerator and the denominator, so there's definitely a regime where a over b is bigger. But we could also imagine a situation where a plus 2b over a plus b is the bigger quantity. For example, if I let b be very big, that's going to, approximate 2, whereas a over b becomes really small. So we're talking about root 2 being between two things, and yet the role of which of those two things is bigger and which of those two things is smaller can actually switch. Now that seems like an obstruction, but, and I'll stop there with spoiling the question, this insight is actually the thing that can lead us to the correct approach. So we can get quite a lot of mileage just out of talking about why the problem is hard, and even if we're not coming up with any ideas for lines of attack, we're showing the interviewer that we do have an insight into what's actually going on. Finally, it's really important to show enthusiasm and interest. Now, this might sound like very obvious or generic advice, but the importance is often understated. You have to remember that at an undergraduate level, in a technical subject within the mathematical or physical sciences, there's going to be a huge transition away from rote learning, where you just apply the same method again and again, and towards creative problem solving, where you'll either need to come up with your own method for each problem, or at the very least demonstrate flexibility in adapting methods. So undergraduate students need to be very comfortable with sitting stuck with a problem for a long time. Some students who really enjoy subjects like maths at A level, because they can learn a method and apply it again and again and get the right answers, may not enjoy an undergraduate study in the same subject because of the fact it has a completely different flavour. If you're going to cope with being stuck and with having to come up with your own methods and grappling with one problem, possibly for a very long time, half an hour on one question, you need to enjoy problem solving. It can't be a chore to you. Now, it's natural to feel frustrated if things aren't working, especially in an interview where you will be acutely aware throughout of the need to impress the interviewer. But really try as much as possible to show that you're enjoying the process, that you're finding it fun to experiment with ideas, that you're taking thrill in the challenge of coming up with a way to solve this problem. You want to show that you don't mind being stuck and that, to the contrary, you actually take some pleasure from the challenge. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you'd like to put some of the insights into practice, do take a look at the rest of our YouTube channel, where you can find a whole range of interview questions across different subjects. Having a go at these yourself before watching the work solution is the perfect opportunity to develop your interview technique. If you'd like to learn more about the support we offer at Vantage with interview preparation, do remember to visit our website, and likewise do like and subscribe for more similar content. Thanks very much for watching.